I feel a little bit, unprepared to be able to talk so much about you and everybody else. So
it's really quick. I heard music when I was a really little kid, and I knew that was what I wanted to do, so I kept insisting, and here I am.
But she's also a very good ally for us here at Concordia. Definitely has helped bridge some gaps, I'd say, in the last year between the unspoken, I guess, colonialism that's happening, in the structure of the university in terms of the music department. So we've been a really big ally in unsettling a lot of that and, reestablishing new structures that, work for the institution to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion here. So thank you for that, and thank you for being our moderator. It's much appreciated.
Well, thank you for having invited me. Yes. So shall we move on to the most important people here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Cécile. How do you pronounce your final name?
Dokenge.
Dokenge, okay. And we have Marcel Cartouche Gutierrez. We have Pamela Dyer with the bling. We have Eloise Chaquette, and we have Patty Schmidt. So this is a very high-powered, fascinating, rich panel, and I'd like to just start by inviting each of you. There's 5 of you and 6 questions and less than an hour, so my role is mostly to just keep it moving along a little bit. Maybe we should have a signal or something that won't show on the video. Yeah, like if I do a T, just to be wary of your time and kind of buckle it up with that.
Yeah.
I don't want to be pushy.
Sure.
So I'm going to invite each of you, perhaps in turn. Let's just go straight down the table, starting with Cécile. Could you introduce yourself, sort of tell us your roots, where you're from, and so on, and maybe just a couple of your experiences in these male-dominated spaces related to your respective careers, and maybe a bit about the social tools you've acquired in order to deal with these spaces.
And for the archive, can we have you say them
into the microphone? So, my name is Cécile Dokenge. I am a full-time professional musician, guitarist, singer-songwriter, producer, audio engineer. Hey, keep it quiet.
Sorry. That was my live video too.
I've been working in the industry for about 20 years now. Did my undergrad at Concordia here, focusing more on the recording side than the playing side. I'm a lead guitarist. Hey, so which is more common now for non-dudes, let's say, but it's still very much a challenge, and it's something that I work hard at trying to break down the walls of being heard and being seen. So I run my own project. I've been touring a trio for the last 7 years. We have toured across the country, across the pond, major festivals, rooms, all of it, you name it. As far as dealing with being a minority in a straight cis male world, you can't fight the system angrily. So what I found has been the best thing for me has been to focus on excelling at what I do and breaking down the walls by example. So if you're on top of your game, people will notice. If you are professional, people will respect you and treat you with respect. And undeniably, rather than go, hey man, listen to me, you just do what you do and you try to excel at it every damn day that you do it. And that's how you start, right? It starts here and then it propagates. So does that answer quick? I'm trying to keep it short. Yeah, that works.
So Marcel.
Thank you. First of all, it's such an honor to be here with everyone and sharing this panel amongst you. So thank you for having me. I'm going to start with my origins because I'm very grateful for all the sacrifices that brought me also in places like this. My mother is a North African Berber woman coming from my grandparents are refugees, so I just wanted to put it out there because being in those spaces is very important to me because that would not be available a couple of decades ago. And my dad is a Mexican, so I come from a beautiful union. Yeah, they had fun in Mexico. And as for my career, right now, my main focus, I'm a researcher engaged in a fast track program, both my master's and PhD at the Department of Integrated Studies of Education and the Transcultural Psychiatry Department, on which I do research on the benefits of music on well-being on at-risk youth. I also run and organize a collective of women and femme musicians called Lotus Collective, out of the need to respond to a genuine lack of representation. And also run the Rap Battles for Social Justice, which is a collective of artists that take on social justice issues, and we have workshops, popular education. So I do research. I'm an artist as well, a performing artist. Write my songs with Lotus and take up that space, rap and sing, and then community worker overall. I also do research with governmental instances, which is quite stressful, but necessary. So my tools to cope with male-dominated spaces and white spaces as well is I try to be myself and as genuine and authentic as possible, and I always try to bring folks that I feel should be there. So I mentor a couple of people, and I've also been mentored, which I'm absolutely grateful because that's what brought me to the places I'm able to go to. But just making things more visible through action rather than words, and showing that there's a way of doing things differently and structuring things differently. So when I see an issue, instead of angrily talking about it, I do something about it. So that's my way of dealing with things.
Sorry, I totally forgot to mention that I also started Chick Pickin' Mondays at Grumpy's along with Gern some 12 years ago. And that was part of being the change that we wanted to see by presenting a platform for women songwriters and non-binary songwriters. And for the last 3 years, I've taken the concept on the road at conferences, presenting at FMO and Folk Alliance, and basically creating a showcase space for basically like gender minorities in the industry. So that's another way that you can do it too, right? It's just like the rap battles and everything. It's taking matters into your own hands as opposed to waiting for the doors to open for you. So.
Some of you already know that Eloise Choquette has been involved with Rock Camp for Girls, if you were here for the performance a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Wow, that's like very inspiring to hear all of this, and I really relate to actions over words. So I've been on the board of Rock Camp for Girls and Gender Non-Conforming Youth for almost 3 years now, and that's been an adventure. And I'm also, so a bit about me, I'm an architect. So that's like a weird thing sometimes, like in these spaces. And architecture is also a weird field in the sense that it's very creative, but very conservative in many ways. And as someone who's not cisgendered, I feel the odd one out almost all the time. And where I feel like most people around me don't understand me or like what I'm going through. And I feel that even though it's not as much of a male dominated field anymore, the positions of power are still male dominated, and dealing with construction workers also is very male dominated. And also it's a very white space also. And so I'm really, really interested in colonialism and in how architecture is a tool of colonialism in general. And I've been really interested in how like queer studies and gender studies can inform the architectural practice. So that's really one of my interests. And also, you heard that I'm on the board of Rock Camp for Girls and Gender Non-Conforming Youth. So it's also, I have almost 2 full-time jobs. So it's a lot of work, but I've learned so much by getting involved in Rock Camp community. It's been an adventure because we've been going through a lot of change over the past 3 years, and a lot of it is very positive in the end. It took us a while to get there, and we're still not where we want to be, but it's like the journey. We're taking this journey to be more inclusive, be better, and also reach as many youth and as many voices as we can. And I feel that I relate a lot to like words over actions. That's why I feel that's what I feel I'm trying to do. Everywhere it's like uplift voices of people who are marginalized, and sometimes it means like just shut up. Like I am just gonna shut up and let someone else talk, or I'm just gonna make sure that like our youth is like that we put forward to the youth that need camp the most, and just in general try to approach everything that I feel that irks me or is problematic in any way, especially with other white people, like in a way that makes like I don't like just be patient, because I remember how it was a few years ago and try to always like I don't know, just educate people around me, but not in necessarily I don't know. I don't know how to finish this instead of just like yeah. I just try to do my best. I guess.
I think I think you're trying to say that we're always in a process of learning, and that like everyone's going to be in like different processes of learning, and that's okay, and it's okay for you and it's okay for them, but you've got to keep acknowledging that that's where you're at, that we're always needing to be receptive to new information, because we can't ever fully understand somebody else's experience and how to support them, how to support ourselves without always like having our ears open and always being ready to like shift our perspective. Yeah. I was just like, I know what you're saying. I want to like help you. My name is Pamela Hart. I am a sound technician or sound engineer. I've been doing live sound and different kinds of sound engineering for about 12 years. I went and I studied at a private college, regretfully, because it's really expensive, and being a sound engineer pays really shit. I've been working predominantly in live, so working in like concert halls and touring with artists, and that experience, it's really hard to answer this question because the layers of patriarchy are everywhere. And in the music, and I've been involved in a lot of different parts of the music industry, and every single part of that I have had to work out how to respond as a woman, as a queer woman, as a working class woman, as a sound engineer that is also always going to be in a state of learning with my craft, because that's normal and good and healthy. So I guess I would say the other things that I do, which is that I am an educator. I've run multiple sound programs to teach women and non-binary folks how to do live sound. That is a program that I've run through festivals that is free, because I think that things need to be, well, because there are a lot of barriers, and the more accessible I can make things, the happier, well, the more people are learning. I see the role of the sound engineer in the live world and in the recording world as something that has traditionally and continues to be a barrier for marginalized voices to be heard and uplifted. And so that's something that I'm trying to break down by educating other marginalized people in how to do that craft to then support other people, and to also like start working on unpacking the social constructions of our relationship to technology, which is, or I should say my relationship to technology, as in I was raised as somebody that, where it was understood that I cannot work out how to plug in the video recorder and the TV, you know? But actually, that's really easy. I mean, actually, that saying that's really easy is like totally, that kind of takes away from the point. It's just that like all of this is just information and it's not gendered. Did I answer the question?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I also run a choir. I run a chorus for because I think that singing is healing. I'm a vocalist and I run a chorus, so that's for like a feminist chorus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the last
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Definitely not
All this
least,
time.
Patty Schmidt from Utah.
Hello. So I've been working in, it was actually kind of early David Bowie records when I was a kid, and college radio and punk rock and electronic music and this sort of other world that wasn't represented in the suburb I grew up in that changed my life. And music has been the fundamental pillar of everything that I've pursued since. It's my gateway drug to literature, to visual arts, to politics, to social movements. And it still is, even though over the years I've broadened things out. So my first entry into, I guess, what you'd call the music industry was doing college radio at McGill in the late 80s when I got there. And then I was super duper lucky in that, in a way, alternative music at its best, I think, is an already kind of progressive, often queer-friendly kind of space. And I took a lot of that for granted. And then I've since learned how to play with these borders a little more. But I got a job right out of university working for CBC Radio, it was a program called Brave New Waves, which was something that I listened to. And it was a national new music program that ran overnight and was filled with all manner of new contemporary music. And so I got a job as a writer and researcher and the record buyer there. And I realized even at that I was like 23, 24, that there is such power in what gets chosen to be aired. So I did start to realize that I had this power. It was also a very progressive and queer space at the public broadcaster. And everyone who ever worked on all the hosts and the founders were all queer, which nobody knew. And yet we were presenting all of this like punk rock and indie rock and noise and jazz and electronic music to people who were assuming otherwise. And that was a kind of nice subversive power about it. So I worked on that program for 17 years and eventually became the executive producer and the host. And I've always considered myself a feminist, but I think that I kind of dropped the ball sometimes when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I didn't really realize that the promises of equality and all of those things were not really coming true. I played in bands. I had my own kind of quiet, maybe unacknowledged neoliberal dream for myself that everything was going to be merit-based. And because I had always penetrated groups of men, sort of, in terms of my social circles and the people I hung out with, and started record labels with them and started bands with them, I think I just really was not awake until much later about these things. But I was very aware as a programmer and as the host that the things that I chose to put on air and the people that I chose to put on air, that I knew that there was power in that. And I tried to be very conscious of using that with morality and ethics and all of those things. My job for the last 10 years has been as a curator and programmer for the MUTEC Festival, which is electronic music. The jokes over many years were that it was man-tech. And it has had, electronic music in particular, a really bad gender problem. And when you think about the origins of this music, it all comes out of gay club scenes, black club scenes in North America, and then somehow got completely whitewashed over the last 15 years or so. So I started becoming really vocal about the programming because I was until last year the only woman in all of the MUTECs around the world who was at a deciding level, who was a programmer, and decided to stand out in the screaming wind. I tried a couple of years of persuasion. So, hey, have you seen this article about tokenism, guys? Or, hey, have you heard this artist? And when that stopped, when that didn't really get me anywhere, I just sort of upped the volume. And I wouldn't say that I'm very good at not being angry about the way that decisions get made. And I sometimes lose it. So now I'm just the angry one. But it's okay because they now walk a wide circle around me and make sure that we do have some gender and diversity issues in the programming. All this to say, I started screaming really loudly and I got our numbers up to about 35% of women and on paid stages, which was also really important to me. And then there's been a momentum shift in the last couple of years and I am so happy to get on that horse and try to do something about it. But last year we achieved gender parity. It helped that there was some funding and some projects and some government support for that. And it wasn't easy, but and there's all kinds of things we can talk about here. I don't want to take up too much more time, but like the intention of the people you work with, whether or not they're behind you politically and socially and and ideologically. I don't think that I have the buy-in of the men that I work with necessarily, but they also know that there is shame associated with not trying, and the rock still goes up the hill, and if I leave this project, they're now trapped.
Well, thank you, everybody. That was a really generous and informative introduction. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. So now let's pick up the pace a little bit. Let's do a few little quick jabs here. It's no secret that socialization affects us. And for female identifying and gender non-conforming individuals, is it okay if I say people? Is that okay if we just talk about people? Okay. So socialization definitely impacts on people. There's no secret there. But if you could just do some real quick poking in there as to what is the impact of this kind of socialization that we see all around us, not just ourselves, but the social socialization. The impact on people in sound production and in performance and composition, songwriting and song composition. So the real core. So just lift a hand and I'll call your name and we'll go quick round like a popcorn. Okay, so Marcel?
Yes. So I think the impact in terms of how I've been sharing space and seeing how creative we feel we can be when we give opportunities to compose and to listen to each other. I found that women and non-gender binary folks, people that we're talking about, listen to each other more in a way that I'll go to community or I'll go to urban science, which are local jams, in which you can bring your own ideas, but you also have to be aware of certain guidelines. There's a lot of flexing that happens. So a lot of let me show you that I've spent 16 hours on this really cool pattern that you probably don't understand because I'm too intellectual for you. And I see that how we've been sharing space, and when we give opportunities to each other, it's much more compassionate, and it's much more it's kinder to each other and to ourselves, and we listen, and the music is the ego, not the individual. So that's my experience with that specifically.
Yeah, I mean,
Cecile?
this socializing thing is kind of interesting because I come from both my parents were born and raised in Cameroon, and they were part of the generation that fought for independence. They actually were part of the movement, and my mom was one of the few women of her generation, African women of her generations, to actually get an education, a higher education. So there was this notion of you can do whatever you want to do, but there was also very much you are going to fight 50 times harder than anybody else who's already established or who's in part of that. And reason being is that you're walking into a situation that people don't necessarily know about where you're coming from, right? So say, for example, if you're coming in, black or queer or whatever into a white world, right? There are all these preconceived notions about what you do. In my case, I work a lot on the blues scene. There are preconceived notions of what a black artist should sound like as a soul singer, as a guitarist, as a whatever else, right? And so that's part of what you get from that is also trying to figure out how can you stay true to you while trying to access an avenue that's not necessarily embracing your differences or open to the variety, right? So when you're looking at the blues scene, a lot of it, for example, is thinking of pre-war or pre-60s. So when you're coming in with something that's not tradition, it's well, what do you mean? It doesn't matter if you're born American. It's what are you doing to our concept or our notion of what it is? And even if you look at on the other side, it's true for a lot of artists, regardless of the minority, right? So then it's trying to find allies who understand that, we're living times in motion, and you need like community and Cypher and all of that. It's finding the allies within a scene to help it expand and help everybody bring everybody up, right? And it's the same deal that we're trying to do with the chick picking thing, where you're broadening the different aspects of a group or social expression or artistic expression to help everybody move forward, right? So it's, you kind of have this weird thing where you have to say, screw it, it doesn't matter what the system is, I'm going to do it anyways. But you need to find the folks who are going to help you, get through that blitz, right? And so, it's reaching out as well and networking and finding out who are the players in the various fields and just trying to make that connection, right? And sometimes you're going to find people who are going to fight you, but a lot of the times you're going to find people who would actually would rather be on the right side of history. So unfortunately, I think especially as women, we're socialized to shut up and take it. And it's been nice to see a lot of effort made into being empowered and realizing that we do have the fight and that we need to fight and that we can fight, right? So all of that helps to get rid of deprogram how we've been raised a lot of the times. So that's one of the nice things that I've witnessed over the younger generations, is that there's less and less of that box, right, that a lot of us born before the millennium were raised in. So like this panel is an example of that, right? So
Exactly. In a sense, the socialization
the discussion.
is not to network. Put up and take it. Stay in your corner. Don't let anybody else know, especially not your sisters. But then when you do start to network and find the people who support the fight and get angry and yeah. So anyway, I'm not supposed to talk. Eloise?
Well, building on the younger generation, I feel that being involved in rock camp gives me a lot of hope for the future, just because all these biases, all these things that I feel that come from how I was socialized, a lot of these youth don't have them, and like they're so confident that it's very inspiring to look at them and be like, okay, so you're like gonna learn some chords today and play on stage later, and okay, and like why can't I do it? And like just find, like in general also I feel that I've learned a lot like talking to younger people who are much more aware. Like I think maybe it's the internet or like how accessible like information is, that like they're so aware of so many things that I definitely wasn't aware at their age, and they're really, really well spoken and it's very inspiring. So I feel that like building, I see the difference. Like after the week of camp or after Rockademia, you see like there's one youth that comes to mind that last year she was crying during the meets and greets. She didn't want to be there. And on the fourth day, she was doing karaoke in front of everyone and was taking like some space that she really didn't want to take at first. And like stories like that, and seeing how like creating safer spaces or like just spaces where girls and gender non-conforming youth can be like, yeah, no, you don't have to be socialist like we were to like think you can't do these things. You actually can go on stage and do this, and like maybe you're not going to go on stage all your life, but you're going to remember it. So
the socialization question, it's totally shifted, like the gendered socialization that the younger generation are experiencing now, and the one that I grew up with. And I've thought about these things a lot, like, this in-group dynamics, that a lot of the way that casual or leisure space for boys is different from casual and leisure space for young girls and women. And I think that it's so important. I mean, some of the projects I've worked on are about creating cohorts and networks and not recreating exactly what boys and men have done through centuries, which is part of the whole patriarchal, birthday cake. Is that some of the early advice would be, okay, well, women, you need to like enter these male social spaces. And I like that there's social spaces that have evolved separately, but I've also been so ambiguous over the years about, is it good to have women and non-binary and, you know, racialized people separate from whatever the power structure is. And so I go back and forth between these things. And before I didn't like it, and now I really see the merit in it. And now what I really want to do is, because I have some power, is to like inject it in the spaces that I have some control over. And the one thing I will say that I think is so fascinating about the new generation, and I grew up in the 70s when the UN Bill of Rights and all of these promises of equality and peace and everything were so a part of my young imagination, and then kind of very fell flat when I was in my 20s and 30s, and you start being like, is it me? You know, why do I feel weird? Is that this younger generation, and I do think it is a lot of media exposure, they cannot, a lot of them, and I work with a lot of them, cannot say the word feminism, but they feel so entitled to equality because I think they see all of the stories that go through media and all of these things that are on the periphery. Other groups of people on the periphery also have platforms on social media where they didn't in mainstream media before, when that was the dominant form. So I don't use it pejoratively, but the entitlement that the new generation has to opportunity and equality, I think, is the momentum shift that we're seeing.
I think they do say feminism now, though.
Some do, but some don't.
I mean,
I work with the ones
Beyonce.
who don't.
Beyonce, hello. Beyonce shifted it for everybody. I said I was a feminist. I mean, I am a feminist. I have feminist tattooed on my body. I've been a feminist since I understood that I was a woman. And it definitely was not cool for a really long time. And I grew up in like a punk freak scene in New Zealand that was like definitely not feminist, and I stuck to my guns as a feminist. And then I'm 37 now, so I've seen some shifts in culture and in feminism, and I think, and as someone that has volunteered for the rock camp, I'm just like calling on this. I find it kind of interesting and exciting the way that young people talk about patriarchy now, and I think there is a shift in enthusiasm about identifying as a feminist, although it's like very confusing and nuanced because of how it also became like popularized as like a style, which is like a whole other thing. Anyways, socialization, again, that's just like so incredibly layered. I find it difficult, but I would just kind of say off the get-go that I think when we're talking about gender and socialization, we can never not talk about race or class or able-bodiedness or queerness or being a survivor, or all the like layers that intersect constantly in the way that we manage life and its inequalities. I don't have any kind of thread to go on, except for that I thought I would say something charming about the Rock Camp for Girls because it's something that I can think of that relates to this, which is in the very first year that Rock Camp for Girls started in Montreal, I was the gear coordinator, and I gave a workshop on how to set up a PA. I think we talked about this. I think we might have talked about this on the phone anyhow. I gave a workshop on how to set up a PA, and that year we because it was so new, there was like not as many people that had applied to it, so we had let very young campers in, like they were 8 and 9 year olds, which was very special, obviously. So I was like, I'm going to give a workshop on how to set up a PA, and just kind of, so all these campers like stood around, and some of them with only like single digit, ages, and I told them without touching it, like I ran them through with drawings and explanations of how to set up the PA, and they did. They set up a PA. They and there was like not a single struggle with that. There was no struggle. It was just like information. They absorbed it. They did it. Then they were like speaking into a microphone with like FX pedals, being like, "Cool, we just set up a PA," and then they packed it down. And that was that. And it was such a striking moment of realizing exactly what you said, that what happens when you're and I love that so much, as well as like I feel pain because it's so different from how I grew up, and it's so different than how my peers grew up. But it was incredible to see how you can step in before some of that socialization and what can be achieved in that space. So, I mean, that's a reason why the Rock Camp and other programs that's supporting youth are so important, because that shift happens and it can be held through a lot of crap. I mean, it needs to keep being held, but it can hold through some crap anyway. Yeah.
Lovely. I'm glad I asked for quick jabs. Okay, so I'm going to tweak question 3 slightly. So there has been teeny weeny minimal amount of consciousness raising, shall we say, maybe over the last half century, to the point that now there are laws that say that you're not allowed to exclude people on the basis of race or religion or gender preference, and so on and so on and so on. So quite a lot of male-dominant places, and we're in the university, and universities are historically totally patriarchal and male-dominated. A whole bunch of places have gone, well, okay then, kind of grudgingly, okay, we'll include you, but you got to do all the work. Like, they don't create any networks of support or safe places. It's contingent on the people coming in to find each other, to find their way, to create their networks or whatever it is they're going to do. So, I mean, it's obvious that creates some pretty terrible pressures on the individual people involved, because meanwhile they're trying to learn their art or succeed professionally, and then they have this whole other PR thing to do. But I'd be curious to hear you discuss amongst yourselves, what's the impact on the actual quality of the programs, on the diversity and the efficiency and the richness and depths of the programs, when they're grudging and say, okay, we'll include you, but you do the work?
Okay, what?
Yeah, it's a funny question, huh?
Would you be able to
Okay,
lay
so
that out a bit differently?
more simpler, let's take the university. We're not allowed to discriminate, so there is supposedly inclusion, but there isn't really a lot of work done by the university itself to create support networks, or support of any kind really, for the very people who need to be included. So there's a lot of pressure on the individuals, but what's the impact on the environment itself, its diversity, its effectiveness?
What's the impact of them not being accountable to their responsibility?
Thank you.
Is that the question? What's the impact? I mean, it's just a feedback loop,
What
isn't it?
happens when the work falls on the backs of the individuals themselves? Like, how does it affect their art? How does it affect their study? What does it mean when the students are the ones doing the work to get the equality when it should be the university itself?
Providing.
And what happens in those spaces if you have experience there in any institutionalized setting where they say they're inclusive, but the work has fallen on the people trying to be included? So it's a bit of a complex question, but
I mean, I think. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's a bit tricky, right? Because on the one side, like, you're already starting from behind, right? When you figure that you actually have to work towards like building this safe space or creating this safe space, right? So before even like doing any of the work, you're already working double time to try to keep your head above water. So on top of that, you're asking folks who are already like paddling up creek to be active, to be safe, if that makes sense. Whereas when you're coming into a place, you should be safe already. Like, I think part of society's responsibility, and that's whether it's, universities or any other institution, is to make sure that whoever's attending is safe. And I think right now we're at an epoch where we're actually trying to level that field, which means that everybody needs to do their part, and it comes up a lot, like with the whole decolonization and, trying to rebalance the patriarchal disbalance and all that stuff. Whereas like the onus is on you to always educate, to always create a space where you're not going to feel that you're threatened or feel extra pressure, all of that. And it does affect it affects your performance, it affects your state of mind, your mental health. It's exhausting after a while when you're doing all the work to make sure that you can be okay, to try to be at your best doing what you do. That's at some point you need the partners, and you look at any of the social changes, like the big ones, at some point somebody had to say, you know what, this is messed up, and yes, we need to own up to our chunk of the responsibility and actually, give voting rights, or give marriage rights, or give education rights, or give, Yeah, you can't get the shit kicked out of you, right? So whatever that is, right? And you figure that the institutions need to be your partners. The government needs to be your partner. You can't just expect people to just do all the work. And the thing is, once you start having the notion of equality and space for everybody that gets implemented as policy, it eventually changes the mentalities, right? So as much as laws don't change reality, they set us up to have a paradigm switch that eventually becomes second nature to us as a society. And so whether you're university, whether you're an architectural, une boîte architecturale, whatever that is, whatever the setting, at some point you have to go, you know what? There is a problem that we need to fix, and everybody needs to get their hands dirty or to find a compromise or have some kind of sacrifice so that everybody can be okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm gonna put two things in context because that is something that speaks a lot to my experience. So I do research with the government. I'm part of the child welfare system. I'm an alumni. So there's a very low percentage of attendance post-secondary, but also graduate studies. I think we're close to 1% who actually get to go there. And on the other hand, another thing I want to put in context, I also worked with Girls Action Foundation and ran the Girls Club in Park X, which is one of the poorest or lowest income neighborhood in Montreal. So I want to put these two things in parallel. I am extremely strategic in my ways of moving in this world because it is mentally so exhausting to be having to represent your fight, your struggle, being resilient and being the bigger person when you have to constantly educate on the ways that you're being oppressed and excluded. So how I do it is that sometimes I take the shit and I shut up about it and I keep notes. And I learned the language. I learned the academic language. I learned the policymaker language. And then we strategize together, and I never do it by myself. But for instance, there was a really genuine, I'm part of this youth committee overseeing the largest research on the transition of youth coming out of child welfare system. And when they gave me the opportunity to speak on camera to about 3,000 governance people, I said everything. And I mean, I said everything. And they don't have any choice to look into the fact that there's a lack of representation of Black, Indigenous folks on governing bodies, gender, non-conforming peoples, that there's tokenization that is happening at left and right, that the inclusion is not being done with the people who are concerned, but by white men. So those are instances where I just think, fight it, find your allies, but be strategic of your moves. And mentorship is so important in my life. I have maybe 17 mentors and everyone can teach you something. I'm exaggerating, but you get my point. Everyone that wants to help you, I think you have to take it, not be naive in the way that because sometimes it can be exploitative, but most of the times I've had the luck and I think the privilege of being able to have people who genuinely want to bring change and just organize and strategize together. And that's something else I try to do in terms of representation. When I ran the girls club, just make sure that they know and aware that they have so much power and that we have so much power as creative beings, as women of color, and that it's not, you don't have to perform your struggles, you can perform your strength and just be punctual about when you do it so it has a stronger impact. So that's the way I go about this.
If you want to talk before, I feel that it relates a lot to the notion of accessibility, right? How inaccessible a lot of institutions are in the end, or just it made me think of all of this discussion made me think of I worked for a nonprofit briefly and then got through a severe chronic pain and mental health episode, and they are a nonprofit that works towards accessibility and universal design, has a lot of very try to be caring for people living in with disabilities and everything, and they fired me after not even 3 months, not knowing that I had disclosed everything, like knowing that, oh, it's a safe space, you know, they're like really want accessibility, and then realizing that they're actually not, don't want the accessibility of like the people they work, they want able-bodied people, neuro, like, the neuronormative people, and they're not prepared to deal with someone who's not neuronormative and who has like bad chronic pain. So it was eye-opening and very frustrating. And I feel that accessibility, like in my work as an architect, but also in my work as a community organizer, is, you know, it's like, what's like the big deal? Because it means not just like physical accessibility, but like accessibility, like everyone who doesn't have the resources, especially like something like Rock Camp. We try to go, like, because a lot of our campers used to come from very like middle class white families, and who like they can't afford like guitar lessons like on during the year, and we really try to go to communities that like, well, our programming doesn't exist anywhere, and how to make it more accessible, and like how to try to like break these institutions who like, but it's so much work that indeed like sometimes it's like choosing the fight and trying to do your best, but it's I don't know how like I'm going with this, but just like that I feel that the big problem with doing the work and like trying to like do some self-care is just at the end of the day it's like it is hard, and it's a question of accessibility, because I don't remember who said that at first, but I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so it's all that to say that, yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, but sorry, I'm a bit fried, like after the whole day of like organizing. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Both of you mentioned the importance of like policy and laws and that kind of stuff. And I've been racking my brain for like the last couple of years when I've been in charge of representing this feminist project through the festival, and having to do the press and articulate it all, and also make argumentation with my colleagues, and how much extra self-education I have to do to like find the words, find the logical formulas. And I think that what works in the so let me just also say that I feel like the baseline that needs to be communicated is kind of, my dad is the example, who's a climate change denying, Doug Ford voting, slightly racist, slightly homophobic guy. And so explaining feminism to your dad, or, you know, the racism, being able to articulate stuff so logically and clearly to someone like that those are the breakthrough moments after law and policy. Because it trickles down, law and policy. And in the arts community where I work, the federal government has set a new agenda that trickles down to the arts councils, who also are going to implement new policy. There's a lot of indigenous initiatives. Now, finally, after like many years, women are on radar. They never were part of what you had to report as an arts organization or a festival. I found that shocking, even though we have Canadian content laws, you know, where it's like 50%. Like, how hard is it to make another one? So, and out of laws tend to come quotas. And I've been thinking about, why doesn't it happen by itself? What about moral imperatives? But it has to be law and quota and number, and that is the only way to right the ship. And it's going to be uncomfortable for other people who might get pushed off for a minute, but it's not a pie, you know, it's not a zero-sum game at all. And then everything gets normalized. Once policy and law, this is how come we can vote as women, you know? It wasn't because it was a good idea. People had to argue for it. And then it trickles down and becomes so normal, it's boring. It's not a novelty to find people of color or women in certain industries anymore, or in positions of powers. And then it goes away, you know? And then there's the pipeline idea. It's not just about law. It has to also have some back end to it, where universities have to open their doors in their electroacoustic departments to more women and marginalized people, you know? Just do it. It's going to change the world. The world is already changing. What you put on stages is reflected in the audience. It's all like very logical. It's statistically borne out. So once the novelty and the law and all of those things have enough time to work, I feel like we could get somewhere. But policy, I feel, is really where it all starts. It's the only thing that people will listen to, who try to make all the other boring social arguments and the unthought of or inconsiderate ways of dismissing people otherwise.
I would just
quickly add that teaching also, like, and what you teach. Like, I feel that one thing we do at Rock Camp is like girls' rock history and how, like, who we decide to talk about during these moments. And like, it's all starts with that. If you talk about Indigenous artists and like Black artists and in the girls' rock history or in any history, like, then people are going to know it exists. If you don't, like, it's, and then history shapes a lot. So it's just history and policy go together anyway.
Yeah,
So.
So Pamela, give you a chance to get a little word in here.
Sure. I mean, I'll speak to the effects of the lack of accountability of education institutions on students, right? I've only been a student once, really, kind of twice. Once I'm very working class person. I do not have my high school certificate. None of my family have their high school certificate, and I applied to a private sound program because I was like a very naive New Zealander who thought that student loans didn't really mean anything, because New Zealand has a much more lax, or it used to have a much more lax relationship to debt to the government than what Canada does. So anyway, I applied to a sound school, and I was one of two women in the program. And the way that was Recording Arts Canada here in Montreal. That's why I moved to Montreal. I was in Ottawa before. And the impact of their lack of accountability was that I was exhausted, that I almost dropped out over and over again, that I lent onto the support of my lover and my friends and my family to constantly keep me in the program, because I was managing so much sexism and so much classism, and it was very, very difficult. And I did finish that program top of the school because I'm very smart. And then the impact thereon after was that I knew I was not safe in the music industry. I knew I was not safe as a sound technician, and that was a continuing process. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's unfair. It has a huge impact on the students. It doesn't really work. I don't think just injecting marginalized people into environments where they're vulnerable is a successful program. I think you need to look at what that experience is going to be like and have your ears open and ask questions about what kind of support they need, and not just take a fucking photo of them to put on your program.
Yeah.
You know, Roxanne Gay did a talk at McGill within the last year, and she's a professor, and she was talking about this sort of working within institutions, and she had an opportunity to give out a couple of scholarships to people of color in her department, and she said, she's like, here's the point, you can't just put one in at a time. She's like, I had the power of two, and I argued to have two so that there would be support and allies.
We leaned on each other, myself and the other girl, we leaned on each other.
But these are the strategies beyond when you know that the institution is not going to provide the support resources or any of that.
Well, so much so that when I would challenge them on some of this sexism that existed, I was actively rejected. I was, you become a difficult person, and you are a difficult person because you're exhausted from managing all of the crap, and that's so fair,
There was nothing to see there, gaslighting, that kind of thing. Okay, so female identifying and gender non-conforming individuals in the music industry. I think you really have laid out quite clearly what the current situation is and many of your thoughts on it. So we didn't start right on the dot of 4, and this is an important discussion, so I don't really want to just say, well, it's 5 o'clock, so we have to stop now. So I'm not going to do that. However, I am going to go ahead to question 5, and then I'm going to ask whether it would be okay with you when we get to question 6, which says, is it possible to create sustainable support systems, and so on and so on. I think many of you have the questions. That at that point that we could open it up and include our listeners, our very attentive group here. Okay, so let's start with real quick. any positive changes that you have noticed in your own professional environments, but especially in the structures of those environments? Is there anything worth mentioning?
I think already the fact that the art councils, for example, are making a big push to be inclusive is huge, right? Because that trickles down in all the different industries. So that's one change that I've definitely noticed over the last few years. And just opening up as well in terms of non-traditional styles. So there's definitely, it's not just talk. There are measures that are being implemented to try to level out the field on a federally and provincially cultural level. As well, things like Key Change or any of the organizations that are trying to get the festivals and a lot of other organizations to level out or equal the playing field. So there are definitely a few moves being made at higher levels. I'm hoping that's going to trickle
And when you say the
down.
arts councils, we're talking money, right?
We're talking money. Like we're
yes.
talking like significant money,
Yeah.
just not a symbolic $20, to have a Coke and a smile,
So-
but actually like fund your projects. And what's nice about it, or one of the things that I enjoy about it, is that it's not just tokenism. So it's not, oh, you suck, but we'll give you money anyways, just to have our numbers. It's actually, no, we want to help the folks who've got something to say or who've got something to do. So for all the naysayers who are like, oh, well, tokenism, it's going to like lower the quality of whatever else, that's not the case at all. And I think that's one of the things that's nice about this initiative, is that it is about quality as much as it is about parity and diversity and all of that. So that's nice to see, as opposed to just thinking that women are being hired or people of color are being hired simply for numbers, because that is actually more negative than positive in my opinion. But when you're actually supporting the folks who are kick-ass, it definitely makes a huge difference and impacts positively all the different fields.
Yeah, I'm just gonna piggyback on what you were saying. I'll give 3 quick concrete examples so we can move along. So we did a recent partnership with Factor, which is another funding body. There's 2 federal funding bodies for recording arts. There would be Factor, which is public and private, 50% approximately, and then there would be the Canadian Art Council. So that. With Factor, we came together with Montreal Women in Music and Lotus Collective to actually create networking and also jam sessions opportunities to straight up, like the Siobhan Battles, who is the Quebec rep, was like, you need to put us in touch with who needs to be funded, and specifically focusing on women and non-gender conforming individuals. So I think that's exactly an example of funding bodies being very much aware that there's a lack of representation and also a lack of accessibility. Who gets to access those, just the knowledge of knowing that there are funding that is available. So that's really one cool steps. And then on a more community based level, I do a lot of work. I do a lot of grant writing. I do work with Urban Science, which is a beautiful, I love them. They're my homies, but male dominated. There's only one women who identified artist who's an MC, no musicians at all. But we are developing a much better relationship where the steps want to be taken. And whenever there's an incident that happens at one of the nights, it's a weekly jam, the organizer comes to me and asks me, hey, how can we tackle this? So there is a willingness to try to change things. And I think that's already a great first step. And the other great concrete thing is that our drummer from Lotus Collective, Celine Tai, is now part of Community. So she's the first woman drummer who is part of the roster. I think that, as just understanding of how sound works, the sound organizer, it's a big role to take on, and I'm very happy and very proud of her to be able to break that glass ceiling.
I feel that maybe like three things also quickly. First is that this year specifically, for the past 3 years we've asked for a grant basically to hire students or like young people during the summer. This year they decided to change radically how they go about, and instead of saying students, it's for 15 to 30 years olds. That like there's no other conditions, which is great because they had to be full-time students, but there was so many requirements. I was very annoying and it was not accessible for most people. And so now they removed it and also increased they insisted on how like specific, like, do you work with marginalized people and like race, gender identity, queer, like, and really like saying, if you do, how do you do it? And like really making sure that like, and saying clearly, if you do, you will, like, we want to know more about your project and we want to give you more money. So I thought it was a really great shift because having applied for the past 3 years, it was always so convoluted and like we would not get all the funding we wanted. I don't know how much funding we will get for this year, but I'm hopeful because I feel that like when I looked at the box we like could check, there was a lot, and like because they really want to emphasize on like grassroots organizations that don't have access to a lot of funding, that work with marginalized youth, and yeah. So, and the second one would be more just the community level. There's been way more, we've been having way more presence in the media in general, and that has had like more people apply in like wider like circle that we're used to. So instead of being just the same people, the community like burnout that we've experienced over the past 10 years, like we like slowly are shifting it because there's more and more people interested. And maybe the last thing would be just how structurally our like board has changed, and how we, instead of like, it used to be a very white org, and how like we decided to change the structure and put anti-oppression forward, and having just the board be like include more marginalized identities. So
I'm sorry to interject here. So I'm hearing that in fact I didn't realize that we couldn't run over. There's the recording things, and also apparently the room has to be used. So what we could do, once we liberate the room, is that we can continue talking about, is it possible to create a sustainable support system with those of our listeners who have been so faithful and stayed with us, off in the lounge perhaps, but just to the positive changes. If each of Patty and Pamela have one super fast one, and then we're all going to thank everybody, and we're going to have to wrap it up just because of technical and scheduling difficulties.
In my work, it's a 1.5. The first is that the colleagues that I work with, the men who I program the festival with, there are two, they're at the point where maybe they're not feminists, but they notice now. They notice when they look at lineups when there are no women involved. And so once you start noticing, you can't stop noticing, and that is part of a process, and everyone goes through it. And last year, it was Key Change was actually a big partner of the festival, and I put together a 2-day symposium on issues around music and feminism, and helped to build a 40-plus cohort of women identifying artists, and we're going to try to keep them in touch. And there's this idea of understanding how in a network, or when you create networks and cohorts, that if you don't maintain them, or one of the nodes dies, that they all fall apart. And so figuring out how to sustain those systems is really the next brain puzzle.
I think what was really cool here is that we're seeing like so many different positions of where change needs to happen, and that's really what I feel like is like most important, and the only thing that truly impacts is that you have to hit it from every single space. And you know, you've been talking about policy, and you've been talking about these bigger organizations that choose what artists are going to be on the bill, and then you're talking about being that artist as being confident on the stage, and then you're doing work at like with youth at a community level, and then you're doing work with like marginalized youth that are like, you know, POC youth that are taking up space in this other way, but nothing works alone. Like there isn't actually one thing that can and we can be like, yay, that thing's working. Like you can't be a kick-ass artist is taking up space unless you feel safe and unless you've had access to those instruments, unless you feel confident enough to get down there. You can't be that confident unless you're going to the rock camp and then you go to an education institution where then the institution is like supporting you and not shutting you down, and then you step out of that and you feel safe enough to deal with the other bullshit that's in the world. Like, it's just layer, right? And it's work. We are seeing positive change because everybody's doing it, but there's so much work to go. Yay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
And now we will leave the room as fast as ever we possibly can.